I'm joined by my guest, George Szamuely in Budapest. He's a podcaster at The Gaggle, which can be found on YouTube and locals. In Paris, we have John Laughland. He is a university lecturer in history and political philosophy. And in Nice, we cross to Alex Mihailovic. He is a veteran reporter and foreign affairs analyst. All right, gentlemen, crosstalk rules in effect. That means you can jump anytime you want, and I always appreciate it. Let me go to John first in Paris. In Le Figaro, in the pages of Le Figaro, we had Emmanuel Todd talk about global change going on. And the epicenter of that change, of course, is Ukraine. But he characterizes it as already we're in the Third World War, because I think a lot of us have been watching the commentary ever since February of last year that we could be going, we're on the edge of, we could, all this kind of stuff here. This anthropologist, if I'm not mistaken, he says we're already in it. John, your thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I know Emmanuel Todd, and he's mainly famous for having predicted the end of the Soviet Union in the 1980s on the basis of the falling demographics of the Soviet Union. Is it a Third World War? Well, yes, there are some aspects in which it's a Third World War. Obviously, as he says, it's, as we know, America against Russia. It's not Russia against Ukraine. Maybe he's right that it's America against Russia and China. There's an important aspect that he didn't mention, which, of course, is that there is more than one front, which is what would make it qualify as a world war. And the other front, of course, is Syria. That front has calmed down in recent months and years. But Syria was, in a way, the first front in this war, which is now, of course, being played out in Ukraine. Just as in the Second World War, there were earlier wars which are not normally counted as part of the Second World War, but which, when you look at it, probably were, let's say, early tremors, which indicated the earthquake to come. I'm thinking of the Spanish Civil War.
Right.
And there's a lot of similarity between the Ukraine War and the Spanish Civil War. Yeah. Of course, there wasn't an invasion of Spain by a foreign country, as there is in the case of Russia and Ukraine, but the Spanish Civil War is well known, of course, for the intervention practiced by outside powers, by the Nazis on the one hand and by the Soviet Union on the other. So the Spanish Civil War was a proxy war, much as we have in Ukraine. And of course, to some extent, it was a precursor to the Second World War. And so in that sense, I think he is right. The big difference, of course, is that we're in the nuclear age now. And that's why you can't really compare the 1930s to the present period, because the big powers, America, Russia, and China, and so on, know that there are very serious limits to how much they can go to war with each other. And that's why I think probably I would be less pessimistic than Emmanuel Todd. I wouldn't necessarily say that we're going to go towards a head-on conflict, but a proxy war, definitely.
Well, George, your thoughts too, because Emmanuel Todd in his article, he talks about it, this conflict, as he claims we're in the middle of this Third World War. It's existential for the West, particularly the United States and Russia. That's a very interesting characterization, because I would say from a security point of view, it's a proxy war on the part of the United States to weaken Russia. We've even heard the Secretary of Defense say that. But he says it's just as existential to the West, which is quite an interesting characterization. Go ahead, George.
No, I think that's right. And it has become existential because the West has chosen to go down this path. It didn't have to be existential. For Russia, yes, absolutely, it's existential. But once the United States essentially committed itself in such a wholehearted way to this war and has refused all reasonable attempts to negotiate and to bring this to some kind of a conclusion, then it has now become existential for the United States. It's very hard to see how the United States can back away from where it's come to. And in fact, all the indications are that the United States is preparing to escalate. There's an article in the New York Times the other day in which clearly US officials briefed the New York Times reporters that they were planning to help Ukraine target targets inside Russia, including Crimea. Well, once the United States goes down this path, then I think it's all bets are off, and then we really are in the territory of shooting wars. So I wouldn't be quite so optimistic, well, because they're nuclear powers and it won't come to that. I think that it could well come to that simply because this is where we've got to. Because once United States embarks on this course, helping to target targets inside Russia, Russia will retaliate. The first thing it will do will be to target American satellites. It has to, because it's the use of satellites that enables this targeting to take place. And then who knows how the United States would respond. So, you know, I think we are in a very dangerous situation.
Yeah, it's very interesting. Alex, let me go to you. George and John are both right, depending on how you want to look at the argument here, because this was a craven choice on the part of the United States. They did not have to go in to use Ukraine as a proxy. It has done it, and it will continue to do so, just for the very reasons of prestige and to make sure its allies stay with it, which I want to talk more about. But I mean, this is a choice on the part of the United States, forcing its NATO allies to go down this path. Go ahead, Nice.
Absolutely. I mean, look, this pressure has been on for a long time. We're not talking about the past year since the war broke out in Ukraine. I was reporting back in 2014 of JTTF, which are Canadian Special Forces, JTTF-2 to be exact, being on the ground in Ukraine and training what were known to be, I mean, the Wall Street Journal has written about it, neo-Nazis, the Pravi sector at the time, and as well as the Azov battalion. Now, that means the Canadians were involved, the Brits have been involved, the French have been involved, and of course the Americans have been involved. There's this push, with some call it NATO creep, you can call it what you like. This did not have to go down that way it was. We saw Russia in discussion at the very point saying, hey, all you got to say is that you're not going to spread NATO in this direction, give us a couple of guarantees, and there will be no problems here. But the U.S., whatever was coming out of Washington, D.C. was, well, you know what, they got the freedom to do whatever they want. This country, you know, everybody's got their own will and freedom to do what they want as an individual nation, which we've seen time and time again, the United States not allowing countries to do what they want. But when it works out for them, it works. Ukraine was this example. And that's the thing. Russia reacted. Now, the question is, and I agree with Todd 100%, Russia did not have to react the way it reacted at this time in history. There was no immediate threat that something was going to go down, that there was any bigger spillover of NATO into Ukraine at this moment. They got suckered in, they got pulled into this war, and now what we have is something that can lead to a third world war. What I want to say, though, is we were talking about World War II. Let's go back to World War I. This looks like World War I. Watch this movie, A Long Road to War. It tells you the whole story. World War I started decades prior to World War I actually starting in Gavrilo Princip in Sarajevo. And it was all about Russia. It was the Germans and the Austro-Hungarians wanting to get to Russia. This is similar in that aspect. It's NATO wanting to get to Russia, to weaken Russia. And now we have this situation on our hands that can become much, much worse than just a situation, a proxy war in Ukraine.
Yeah, well, John, I mean, we all agree it's a proxy war here. We can talk about how it is existential for what party, but I would posit that it is existential for NATO, not for American security, not by a long shot, but NATO. They're putting everything on the table here. This is a game of Russian roulette here, and they're the ones pulling the trigger. Go ahead, John.
Yeah, I think that's right, and I think that I agree with Emmanuel Todd as well that it's existential for the United States, in the sense that definitely for NATO, but also for the Americans in the sense that the post-war hegemony of the United States is, of course, on the hegemony of the dollar as well as on military supremacy, and the Americans and the Europeans as well, for that matter, have shot themselves in the foot on the monetary question. By, as we know, freezing people's assets and essentially stealing the money of other countries. And this is an incredibly stupid thing to do, because, of course, it means that no one is going to put money into your country ever. No third power and so on is going to do that, because they've seen what can happen to their money. And if the dollar hegemony crumbles, as it is doing with the increasing closeness between not just Russia and China, but also between Iran and Russia, Saudi Arabia and Russia, then indeed the hegemony will be threatened. Todd makes another point, which is about cultural hegemony.
Oh, John, you're getting ahead of me. But go ahead, please, because I wanted to do that in the second part. Go ahead, start.
In the Second World War, in the Cold War, The Soviet Union, of course, had a large amount of soft power in the sense that it was the leading power of communism, and communism existed all over the world. And so communists from Latin America to the Far East looked to Moscow. Now it's the issue of conservative values versus wokeism. You know, the collective West, NATO, and so on has gone deeply down the woke route. You know, gay marriage and transsexualism and so on. And Russia's, and of course, that doesn't go down very well in most other parts of the world. Not in Africa, not in South America, probably not even in the Far East. Excuse me. And Russia, of course, is playing that card quite dexterously. So in that sense, I think that the cultural hegemony of the West is also under threat, as well as the military and economic hegemony.
Well, George, this is one of my favorite topics to talk about. I got 30 seconds before we go to the break. The cultural element is key to this argument here. Go ahead, George, real quick.
Well, it is key because during the Cold War, the Soviet Union really wasn't a particularly appealing cultural phenomenon. I mean, it was culturally very conservative, very stuffy. Politically, it was obviously very unattractive. And as an economic model, in terms of its consumer goods, lack of, it wasn't very attractive. But it did have military power. Something has changed drastically, and that is that the West is now culturally again gone down a very strange path.
All right, George, hold that thought, George. I got to go to a hard break, and after that hard break, we'll continue our discussion on global conflict. Okay, I want to go back to George in Budapest here, because we started talking about a really critical issue about this global conflict, and it is on the back of an article by Emmanuel Todd, fascinating thinker and writer. George, I mean, if you're, you could talk about economics. Like you said, the Soviet Union was not an attractive model for many in the world, but it was anti-colonial, it was anti-Western. So that was, enough to get you interested in. But now we're in a very different era. The Western model, cultural model is very unattractive for most of the world right now. And we add to that the decline of hegemony, the global South, or the global majority, as I like to refer to them. They don't have any appreciation for Western culture anymore, if they even can call it culture. And they're not afraid of the West like they used to be. George.
Yes, I think so. And the West has gone down this strange path of wokeism, in which it has challenged traditional relations between men and women, traditional marriage. It's embraced gay marriage, and now it's embraced trans rights. The idea that you can just simply define your own gender and everybody has to fall down on their knees and accept your claim to be a man or a woman, irrespective of your biological sex. To most of the world, this just seems so bizarre and alien, and this is what they come to associate with the West. Moreover, all of the appealing aspects of Western culture have now ceased to be appealing. So Hollywood movies, which used to be loved, admired around the world, the gangster movies, the screwball comedies, all the things that were very popular, have now come to be hated. They see these movies all very stupidly violent, women beating up men and all the rest. And the other countries are coming up with their own cultural brands that are actually, becoming quite popular around the world. Chinese cinema, Hong Kong cinema, even Taiwan cinema, and Hollywood has lost its appeal, and that was key to American soft power. The all-pervasiveness of Hollywood in its films and its television. Once it's lost that, then the American soft power, goes out of the window.
Alex, I mean, what we're all talking about in this part of the program, it hasn't been used yet, but it's all about different forms of sovereignty, cultural sovereignty, societal sovereignty. But there's I want to go back to Emmanuel Todd. He says that Europe has become a kind of imperial protectorate, which has little sovereignty. And for our viewers, he's focusing on the outcome of the Second World War. Germany and Japan primarily, they are the main protectorates, and the spheres in which American power revolves around, in Europe and in Asia right here. How do you look at that? Because it's really quite remarkable. You know, you have the President of the United States with the German Chancellor, which I refer to as Sergeant Schultz, next to him in January of last year, and they were talking about the Nord Stream 2, a German-Russian project. And, well, how will you end it? We'll end it, okay? I mean, and then you have the German Chancellor standing there smiling like a chimpanzee. I mean, look like a complete buffoon, okay? Germany did nothing. As a matter of fact, nobody's really interested in what happened to the pipelines. It's extraordinary how submissive these countries are when particularly Germany is the powerhouse of Europe. Alex and Nice, your thoughts?
Well, not only is Germany the powerhouse of Europe, but Germany was seen as a green powerhouse, a country that was moving this continent forward when it comes to green everything. And then you blow up a pipeline and cause more environmental damage than only God can tell. But I don't know how much damage. It was a lot. They're saying it was one of the biggest environmental disasters that's happened in a long, long time. Who did it?
We'll never know. We'll never know.
You got to keep on guessing on that one. But hey, look, Europe is Europe. It's still a step better than what we have back in Canada. I can't speak for the United States. I have to qualify myself here. I'm a big supporter of Pierre Elliott Trudeau, the old Trudeau, and what he said, which was that what you do in your bedroom is nobody's business. I feel 100% like that, and I agree with that 100%. But once you start telling people what to do, once you bring transvestites into school to dance around children, once you let transvestite or transsexual people into men into races with women, once we start murking up these lines, things start not to make sense. Now, I'm going to tell you something. That pendulum might have swung in one direction, and it's in a crazy direction right now. But there are a lot of people, and they're not looking towards Russia or towards the South or towards China or anybody else. Canadians and other countries are looking towards people within their own nations to take that step back and how that pendulum lands someplace in the middle. Again, all for gay rights, but don't shove it in my face. And that's the problem with the whole wokeism thing.
But Alex, I think I'm certainly the viewers of this program would agree with you. But let me go to John here. We can throw in Ukraine, and we can throw in trans rights, and we can throw in wokeism, all of these things, and much, much more, because institutionally in the West, it is basically a 90-10% imbalance here. I'm talking about education, academia, entertainment, news. I mean, we could go on and on here. I don't have a whole lot of hope that the pendulum is going to go back in the other direction. As a matter of fact, these people doubled down. They doubled down on the proxy war in Syria as a spoiler, a decade after it came to an end. And there's no sign they're going to give up on Ukraine until the last Ukrainian is dead. I have no hope the pendulum is going to move in the other direction. Your thoughts, John?
How much more can the pendulum go? How much further?
Oh, well, these people, I never underestimate these people. Okay, look, I want to go to John here. Go ahead, John Paris.
I think you're absolutely right about the woke element in the cultural world, the universities, the media, and so on. But the point that I was making and that George and Alex were making, I think, is how it plays out on the international stage. And there it doesn't play out well. Nor does another aspect of hegemony that has disappeared, I think, since the Cold War is, of course, moral hegemony.
There you go.
You know, some people may have been anti-American during the Cold War, but the United States had a rather better claim, I would say, to some kind of moral hegemony then than it does now. It's gambled that all away. It's spent all that moral capital with its own illegal wars, Iraq, Yugoslavia, Syria, you mentioned, and so on. And it's also gambled it away because, of course, you know, Peter, you mentioned the pipelines. The relationship between the United States and European countries is the relationship between a mafia boss and pizza parlor owners. You know, if you don't do what they say, they come round and smash up your windows. Everybody in Europe knows that the Americans blew up the pipelines. Everyone in Germany knows that the Americans blew up the pipelines. Yet it's not that they're submissive. Of course they're submissive, but they're submissive because they can't say it in public, because the Americans control them through violence. And they know that if they were to point the finger at the Americans for having blown up the pipelines, then the Americans would come and blow up something else again. And that, obviously, while an extremely unpleasant position for the European governments, and one they can't get out of for the time being, of course, is the very opposite of any kind of moral hegemony. So that also, I think, is a cause for some kind of some glimmer of light on the horizon.
You're so absolutely right. You know, George, I saw a couple of weeks ago George Mearsheimer doing a debate with Carl Bildt, that moron Bildt, and it was in a Canadian setting, if I'm not mistaken. And Mearsheimer, which I have some differences with him, he's not a good debater, but he did say something that really resonated and shocked the crowd. He said, American foreign policy is like Godzilla, okay? But I mean, yeah. I'm just echoing what John was saying right there. Godzilla, when Godzilla's angry, there's no compromise. You don't talk with Godzilla, George.
Yes, that's a very good point, and this is really the problem, is that what they're getting is U.S. aggression, U.S. lies in order to justify aggression, and above all, a contempt for the national sovereignty of other countries. And this is again part of this issue of soft power, because Russia and China are the leaders of a kind of global movement on behalf of national sovereignty. They say, well, like, you know, you are not a serious country if you allow others to determine your fate. And unfortunately, the Europeans, stupidly, having walked into NATO, having walked into the European Union, suddenly waking up and finding that they have no national sovereignty, that their destinies are being decided by others, and that they've just been deluding themselves that they somehow decide things for themselves. And I think when Russia and China point this out, then, you know, the rest of the world listens and says, yeah, that's absolutely right. You know, you are not a serious country if you allow others to determine your foreign and security policy. Yeah. And this is really what has happened to Europe. That Europe has just simply subordinated itself completely to the United States. They are not serious countries.
You know,
if I may interject, if I may interject here. If you're an outlier like Serbia, you're in trouble. Right? So you're one of these countries that's an outlier that doesn't want to be subjugated by the European Union, that doesn't necessarily want to be subjugated by Russia either. You're trying to be in the middle, just like Yugoslavia was during the Cold War. And what happens to you? Well, you get a situation.
But Alex, I'm agreeing with you, Alex. It's interesting because the West, traditionally since the Second World War, has tried and shown itself as a progressive, in a positive sense, leader. And, you know, and what is possible. And so what the Europeans have done is that they've gone under the captive wing of the United States and the collective West. Doesn't that send a message to other countries in the world? Do not go down that path if you want to have control of your sovereignty. Go ahead, Alex.
Well, you know, the issue is it's not a control of sovereignty anymore. It's a question of, do you want the hell bombed out of you? We saw that happen in 1999. And look, there's rumors about weapons being diverted from Ukraine down to Kosovo and down to Bosnia right now. The situation on the Kosovo border is not improving at all. Whatever's being said, I mean, this is why it went back to World War I. Yugoslavia or Serbia at the time, 1,000 times over, pleaded with the Germans. The Germans would make a request. The Serbia or Yugoslavia at the time would say, yes, we'll do it. Yes, we'll do it. Yes, we'll do it. Until the request became so outlandish that they couldn't fulfill the request. And there you go. Now you got a war. That's the exact same thing that's happening in Serbia right now. The requests are outlandish when it comes to Kosovo, and the push is on. It's when Americans decide to pull the trigger, it's going to be pulled.
Well, Alex, when they decide to pull the trigger, or according to Emmanuel Todd, they already have, but they don't want Americans to die. That's very interesting. They want everybody else to die for their goals. And I think they're outdated and very unwanted global ideology. Gentlemen, that's all the time we have. I want to thank my guests in Paris, Nice, and in Budapest.